So today's sermon, I feel like, has the potential to be a really difficult one to have to deliver because the issues that we're going to be going over are particular to women. And so for me to have a right to discuss that, I know it's a little bit difficult. There's a big potential of being insulting to women in what I have to say, but I still feel responsible to try. Because we're going through Leviticus, trying to understand the things that the Lord commanded. They are here. They need to be discussed and try to understand them to the best of our ability, the best of my ability to present them. And so I'm going to do that with all the humility that I can muster. And also, I made a joke about this earlier in the week, but I would ask that you just pray for me in that I would be able to actually do this and present what it is that the Lord wants us to know. Because there are valuable things, I think, principles for everyone. That everyone has a place in God's household that comes to him. And those he has atoned are then held to his standard of cleanness. And so we need to respect what he's done. Respect our place and the place of others within his family. And help one another to be holy. And so for this, we're going to be starting in Leviticus chapter 12. You may have already made your way there. But if not, if you want to be able to follow along, which I highly recommend, you actually read your own Bibles. It's just a good way to be in them, even as we're here together and I'm reading these things in Leviticus chapter 12. And we're going to start with verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel. If a woman has conceived and borne a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. She shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her customary impurity. And then she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who has borne a male or a female. And if she is not able to bring a lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. One is a burnt offering, and the other is the sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean." I want to start off with a clarification, and it's something that we discussed last week as well when we talked about those dietary laws, because I think it's important, especially in reading these passages, just to really drive this home, that there is a difference between something in Leviticus being unclean and being sinful. So when we're talking about something being sinful, we're talking about it having a moral implication, that there's actual guilt, that someone has done something to purposefully go against the commandments and the will of God in defiance of him. That's the real issue that we all have. That's what separates us from God in the ultimate sense, causes death that is eternal. For something to be unclean, as Leviticus presents it, that's a step down. That it does still have a symbolic connection to sin, but it's really about being ritually unacceptable. It's something that just can't be part of the worship system. And so it can't go into the tabernacle, is really what that boiled down to. That was the issue that it created. And so this is not saying, when it says that a woman is unclean for a period of time after having a child, it's not saying that pregnancy is sinful. I just really think that that's something that we have to be explicit about as we go through this. And even though the mother has to give a sin offering, we talked about that when we went over them. That it's not just about something, it was for sins that were committed, but it was also for providing purification. That's really what this is about, is purifying. And understanding that what's being purified is not the baby. The baby's not what's causing the pollution here. It's the discharge after birth is what's described here. Now, as far as the actual process of what happened, in the first place, right after the baby was born, for either a week in the case of a boy or 2 weeks in the case of a girl, the mother was unclean and could actually spread that. Other people could become unclean by coming in contact with her, something that we'll go over a bit more in the next section that we'll be going over. Then following that, for 33 days or 66 days, and so either for a total of 40 or 80 days, again, depending on whether it was a boy or a girl that had been born, she was internally unclean. She had an uncleanness herself that meant she couldn't go into the tabernacle, couldn't touch anything holy, but she was no longer able to spread it to anybody else. Now, there was kind of an interruption on that because on the 8th day for a boy, that was when he was circumcised. But then after those 40 to 80 days, that was when the mother had to provide an offering. Bring a sacrifice, first of all, of a burnt sacrifice. And that was the one that provided for atonement, like we discussed. That was the one where everything was given over to God in order to request his acceptance, to be allowed into his presence. And then there was that sin offering that, again, is really about purification. And in the case of that sacrifice was about the purification of the tabernacle itself in order to make it so that God's presence could be there because he would not allow anything unclean in his presence. And that was what that was providing for. And then after that, she was good to go. Now, there is one question, I think, as anybody's going through this, they're probably going to be asking themselves and wondering, and unfortunately I can't provide an answer because it's like those dietary laws, again, from last week where we're really not told why it's the case. But I understand that we're going to wonder why it was longer for girls than it was for boys, and I really can't explain that. The best reason that I found, the best guess at an explanation, was that the girl, she was going to have these experiences in her life too, and so this is a way of kind of telescoping them and saying that this is what everything for her is going to follow with as well. And I don't know. That was, like I said, it's a theory, but that's not really the point of all of this. And if we're going to say anything with any type of confidence, the only one I would be willing to is that, once again, God said it, and so that's the way it is. It was what the Israelites had to do because he told them so. And that's as far as I can really strongly go. But as far as trying to explain what all of this was for and understand these rituals, I think we do have to look at the next passage that goes along with this. So we'll turn a few pages and look at Leviticus chapter 15 because it ties in here as well. Starting with verse 19. If a woman has a discharge and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be set apart 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything that she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean. Also everything that she sits on shall be unclean. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And whoever touches anything that she sat on shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. If anything is on her bed or on anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if any man lies with her at all, so that her impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days. And every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her customary impurity, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her customary impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And whatever she sits on shall be unclean, as the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, then she shall count for herself 7 days. And after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the priest shall offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for the discharge of her uncleanness. Thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. And so this, to go along with pregnancy, there's 2 more categories that were particular to women within the laws of Leviticus, starting with menstruation and with that process, which created what's called here the customary impurity. That was also referenced in Leviticus chapter 12. And the idea that during that time, a woman would be unclean for a week, and that she could spread that uncleanness, that it was a pollutant for others, essentially. And so that anything that she touched was also unclean, and anybody who touched it, not just her, could not go into the tabernacle during that time. And that they could also then spread uncleanness as well, and so it could affect the entire community. And so she had to be sequestered during that weeks-long period, but once it was over, then everything was back to normal, no offering was required. The more unusual circumstance is for a discharge that ran longer than what was normal, because in that case, The period of time was just indefinite. However long she had that health issue, she was considered unclean. She had to be separated from everyone during that period of time, however long it lasted, if it ever went away. And if it did finally go away, then she essentially had to wait a week, make sure that it was over, and then provide the same sacrifices that were required in the case of a pregnancy, a sin offering and a burnt offering. And reading through this, again, however many times I went over this and having to hear it, and anybody who reads it themselves, it is certainly very uncomfortable to have to go through. It just feels kind of even rude somehow, like it's telling women to be ashamed of their bodies. And that is, a lot of that is coming from our perspective and the place where we stand now as Christians and also being in the 21st century. But even as we go back to it, we have to try to understand that's not where we're supposed to be hung up, is on what it has to say that feels like it's going against women, because that's not its purpose. And for what it's worth, it's not just women. We didn't read the first half of Leviticus 15. That's where it talks about men and a situation that is specific to them, that would make them unclean and not allowed to go into the tabernacle, which is really what this is about. It's not a criticism or a condemnation of womanhood in general. It's about keeping the sanctuary holy. That's how God closes out this passage, is in order to say, don't defile my space. And this is something that would do that. And the reason why it would seems to come down to blood, because we've talked about that before too, and how important it was within this religious system because of what it represented, especially when it was not where it was, quote unquote, supposed to be. Because if we are bleeding, any of us, that represents what you could call a loss of physical integrity, that something is out of place. And when it is, and again, it's not saying, just sort of drive this point home as hard as possible, beat this horse often as I need to. It's not saying that there's something intrinsically wrong with being a woman. It's saying it's just painting a picture, in order to say that that loss of physical integrity is illustrative of anyone's loss of spiritual integrity. When we give up a piece of ourselves through sin, by separating ourselves from God. And so just like how bleeding represents the threat of death, sin actually leads to spiritual death. And why that is important to understand is because if we don't acknowledge that, then we can think that all of our challenges are environmental, that they come from outside of us. That was the issue that Jesus had to deal with, again, with those food laws, where he talked about that and said, well, what you take in, it doesn't really matter. It goes right back out. It's what's in your heart that matters, because people were and still do say the devil made me do it, or it's a result of my upbringing, or I can't control it. My culture taught me that this is right. None of those things apply. Our challenges are really internal, just like our blood. And things that are not inherently evil, things that may have a purpose, they can become evil if they are out of place. Again, just like being cut can be. That there is a danger that comes in the way that we use certain things. And so sin is a matter of personal failure. It doesn't come from outside. And so for women to have to understand their bodies this way and what was inside of them, that is something that gives them that temporary period where they are separate from God's presence, that was a way of saying to everyone that you have something inside of yourself that needs to be dealt with, and so you need to approach God for it. That's what's really being described here. So none of this is to put women in a negative light. And of course, what we should understand, and does need to be discussed, ultimately women are in a positive light in Scripture. An honest one. We have to understand that too, that women and all of us, we understand that we have sin and that we share in this human legacy, I guess, of that, of being separate from God for the things that we choose to do wrong. And that started with our first parents. And for the sin of eating the fruit that they were forbidden to, Adam and Eve were given a curse. And for Eve in particular, her punishment was that she was going to have pain in having children. And so that was something that she had to deal with, and then all other women have had to deal with as a result. But while childbirth is part of the curse of sin, you could say, it's also, more importantly, part of the cure. Because along with that, God also gave the promise that one day a child was going to be born who would crush the head of the serpent who had deceived her in the first place. And that was what all women have been looking forward to and reflecting back on. And we have to understand that life comes through women for every single one of us. But that most importantly, it came through the woman who had that child, who gave life eternal to everyone. That was how Jesus entered the world, in order to live that life as one of us, so that he could die in our place and pay the price for sin and remove that pollution for everyone who has faith in him. And so that is a valuable way to look at women and the place that they have in God's plan. And also understanding that they're welcome in his service. Because that's the thing. In Leviticus chapter 12, verse 4, if we look back on that, we can look at that and see how it talks about excluding the woman. And during that period of time where she was unclean, she was impure, she couldn't come into the tabernacle. We don't want to focus on that negative aspect. What's more important is that it was temporary, that she was actually allowed in. A mother could be in fellowship with God through atonement, just like any man could. That every Israelite was part of God's family, part of God's household. That was what Leviticus was really teaching. And of course, this is what is also taught and expanded upon in the New Testament. And one place that I think is really important in light of what we've discussed today is in Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. It says, "A certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, 'If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.' Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' But his disciples said to him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see who had done this thing. And the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.'" See, it's with the background of Leviticus chapter 15 that we can really understand this story in Mark chapter 5. Because this woman, for 12 years, had been an outsider. She couldn't be around anyone because, according to those ritual laws, anyone who came in contact with her or anything she had been in contact with would be made unclean. And so they would have avoided her, and she would have been required to avoid all of them. So it was an incredible risk that she ran by going into that crowd, where she was almost certainly going to be coming in contact with people. And if they had recognized her or realized who she was or what this was doing, she could have actually endangered her life by that. And then, of course, it took great faith to not only risk the possibility of touching someone, but purposefully reaching out to touch Jesus. Something that was going to defile him, or at least was expected to. But in this case, it didn't. Instead, it purified her. Because that was what he had come to do, was to provide purification for everybody who approached him. In her case, he did make her own up to it. He knew what had happened, and so he called her forward. You can't just slip away here. You have to acknowledge what God has done for you. And that was what she did, but he didn't blame her for anything. He offered her peace, because peace was what he came to provide. Not just for physical healing, not just in accordance with the ritual laws, but true peace with God, atonement, so that we could be in his family, acceptable to him through Christ's blood. That was what he provided, what she, even though she really wouldn't have known it quite at the time, but what she was relying upon there. What really was going to save her and has saved everyone else who has believed in the Lord since then. And so, saying that this thing that had separated her before, it was done away with. She was welcome in. Everyone is welcome in. Now, of course, there are still differences. And that's something that the New Testament does also go into as well. And so just like we see in Leviticus that there are different things depending on whether someone was a man or a woman, we get some of that in the New Testament as well. Probably one of the most important places for that is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15. Apostle Paul, speaking there, says, I desire, therefore, that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness, with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. This is another not terribly popular passage within the Bible, and we're not going to be going really in-depth on it here, because eventually we will be back in 1 Timothy, and when we are going through that book, we'll spend more time discussing all of what this means. But I mostly want to be looking at this for the similar point that we found in what we looked at in Leviticus, which is that this is not saying that women are inferior to men in any way. That's not the purpose. It's for acknowledging that women and men are different, that God has established different roles for them, and that's spelled R-O-L-E-S. That's the type of role that we're talking about here, that we're put in different places based on God's creative order and purpose. And so he has given women that incredible honor that we talked about of producing and training new generations. And this is true, of course, in general, because not every woman has had or can have children. But it's also true in the sense that women are even more generally nurturing in a way that men are not. And so if women are committed to the value that God has given them there, then they will be saved, Paul says. Now, not saved in the sense of final salvation, because again, that comes to everyone through Christ. He's the one who provided it, not the things that we do for ourselves. It's really talking about being saved from a particular temptation, the temptation to usurp what does not really belong to them, in understanding that peace is found in doing what the Lord intends, rather than spending it on envy and conflict and competition. And so yes, what this passage is saying in black and white and based on nature and history is that women are not supposed to be ministers. That's really the best way to understand this passage. It's God's commandment. It's not always something that we're going to necessarily understand, but it's the way that he has made it. And for women, if they're able to kind of come to terms with that, to see that that's not where their value needs to be found, is doing the same thing that a man does, but instead doing what God has given women to do, then that's actually a better place to stand. And that's true for everyone, by the way. You know, that's true for me, that I don't have to be Charles Stanley or something like that in order to have a good ministry. If I'm focused on what he does or anybody else does, what kind of fame or influence that they may have, then that's taking away from my calling. And it's a waste of time, and it's not godly in that sense. And so that's how all of us should look at this, is that we each have our own particular, unique place that God has given us and the diversity that he has established. That's a valuable thing. If we find that value, then we're going to do well. Now, of course, one of the things that can be countered is that it's maybe a little bit too Levitical. You know, we are past those things that are recorded in the Old Testament, and we've served all those regulations that are found there. And so there is no separate place for women, is what might be tempting to say. And that, of course, we don't separate women from men, and we don't follow those purity regulations anymore, and we don't follow the food regulations either. We don't have to fulfill the sacrifices. Yes, all of those things are true, but it's still the principle. Just like everything else that we've looked at, there's something underlying, a meaning that stands throughout time. So yes, Christ offers his purity to all, not just for men, but every man, woman, and child. And he has welcomed everyone who accepts him. And so we should welcome them too. And there should be no sense of inferiority or shame, but we do still have those differences that God valued enough to give us. And so we should value them for what they're worth as well. And we also, even more deeply, need to recognize that our problems come from within us. That's the real lesson here for, again, every man, woman, and child. There is a pollution that we bear, not just ritual, but spiritual. It runs to the core of who we are that we cannot get rid of ourselves. So we have to be washed of that pollution. That's what Christ came to do for all of us. And then when we have been, we need to pursue the holiness that God's Spirit within us inspires. That's what we're here to do. Now, for anyone who's not in a relationship with the Lord, and whether it's somebody here, maybe somebody watching this video later on, or maybe somebody that you have talked to about these things, and maybe the treatment of women is one of the things that they hold up as a reason why they have trouble with the idea of faith. What we need to be able to say is it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Everyone is welcome into God's household to be a part of His family, but you have to admit your need for Him. Admit your need to be cleansed and accept His washing by trusting in Christ. He alone can make you pure by the blood that He shed for you. That's what's most important. It's not the competition between men and women. It's what Christ did for all of us. And if you want to be saved, then that's what you need. And I hope anybody who's in that place can understand that and accept that today. But for Christians, first of all, to my sisters in Christ, again, none of this is to shame you. Because in a sense, it's not about you. The focus should be on the Lord. And for my brothers, even though there are those differences, we have to bear in mind that we are all in the same place. There's no sense of superiority that we can gather out of these things either. Everyone needs Jesus because it's about sanctity, not about the sexes. And so we have to remember that He's removed our defilement to welcome us into God's presence, just as He does everyone. And so we should be devoted to inviting others into His house, no matter who they are.